black, you know. All black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos. All black medallions, yeah. All black, yo.
Welcome to Left of Black. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, your host. We're here in the John Hope Franklin studios, as always, and we're joined today by Professor Courtney Baker, who is an associate professor of English at the University of California at Riverside. She's also the author of Humane Insight, looking at images of African American suffering and death, which is part of the New Black Studies series, edited by Darlene Clark Hine and Dwight McBride, the new president of the New School of Social Research, and published by the University of Illinois Press. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you are one of the speakers who have returned to Duke as part of the 50th anniversary lecture series for the Department of African and African American Studies.
It's so exciting and somewhat intimidating. As I said yesterday at my talk, this is really where I started getting really serious in my research on Black life and culture. So it's really been great.
Talk a little bit about what we might think of as the Black Studies Project. And even to think about Moulton's term of Black study in comparison to Black studies.
Sure. As I've continued now in these almost 15 years since leaving Duke and my various roles in academia, particularly in building and trying to develop curricula in Black studies, I've been, really able to see the kind of contributions that Black study makes to just scholarship in general, and something that I think that I share with Moulton in my estimation of what is the value of Black studies, and Black study in particular, the term that he uses, is really the way in which it challenges knowledge production and challenges in particular the institutions of higher education to kind of really make us think harder and think better about where knowledge production is happening, to not just think of the university space as the only space where folks are thinking, and where Black genius has happened. And that in terms of, thinking about what it means to dedicate oneself to thinking about what it would look like to use education and sustained intellectual work in order to improve not just our individual experiences, like I'm just going to get a job, but to improve life for everyone literally on the planet. Black study is a great place where that is happening.
Right, and the idea of centering Black bodies.
Yes, absolutely.
In this knowledge production.
Right, and that comes back to the kind of the pressures that Black study puts on that boundary, right? And the recognition that the Academy historically hasn't been welcoming to Black people, Black bodies, and Black thought. And that Black study is a place where that knowledge of Black people can enter into the Academy and question the kind of expectations, the kind of methodologies, and really bring not just Black people, though that's really crucial and important, but everyone forward.
In your book, Humane Insight, you're making particular kinds of claims about the visual presentation of Black trauma, Black pain, Black death. And you push back against the idea that those of us who view, for instance, photos of Emmett Till or lynching photos are just engaged in a voyeuristic activity. In fact, you make the argument that our idea of humanity in the context of these photos is really an ideological construct. Talk about that a little bit in relationship to what we should do with some of these images, and historically how these images have been mobilized to do particular kind of political work, in the name of Black bodies.
Sure. So the project started at Duke, and I was in that moment doing two things, and I talk a little bit about this in the introduction. So I was here in graduate school when September 11th happened. So and I'm from New
New Jersey,
Jersey.
right?
And so I saw a space that I knew. I used to actually commute through World Trade
Right. Taking the
Center.
path, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Be completely changed and completely altered. And I found that I couldn't look away. And I was trying to figure out why I kept looking. There was something that I wanted to learn. And I wanted to figure out what I wanted to, what could be gleaned from looking at these images, these horrible images of destruction and of people dying. And at the same time, I found myself encountering Mamie Till and her work, and I do foreground that as an important work, in her activist work, recruiting the spectacle of her own son's body's destruction for the purposes of civil rights. And in that moment, I was resisting looking at those images of Emmett Till. And I had to say to myself, I can't resist these images knowing that Mamie Till Mobley circulated them for a specific reason.
Right.
So really, I wanted to honor what she was doing. And to recognize that she was a visual theorist. In order to be that activist, she had to think in terms of what the image, what the spectacle can actually do, even the spectacle of Black death can do to improve Black life.
Yeah.
So that comes back to this idea of humanity. And to kind of articulate it in the simplest terms, humanity can't be proven, right? If we take, for instance, the image of Emmett Till, in his coffin, there's no verification of a life other than the testimony that this was a life, right? That his body was submitted to a vulnerability, right? But because he's no longer present, he's not able to testify to the life, which is the entire point.
Right.
So there's been in the history of African American life an endeavor to protest against the infliction of pain upon our bodies. And so what I was interested in looking at is the way that not just Mamie Till Mobley, but also folks like Ida B. Wells, most certainly, are using what we've, I think, more and more come to think of as images that have the potential to re-subject Black people to senses of pain. How there have been moments when particularly Black people, and in particular Black women, were in control of those images, were putting them forward to present, this shouldn't be happening.
Right. I was also struck when you talked about lynching photos, right? Because there's always the possibility that the photos get utilized in other ways. And you talk about specifically the way that lynching photos were used really to buttress white supremacy and white power, to make a claim on Black submission in the circulation of these photos. And it immediately made me think of, what we might think of now as the lynching photos of the 21st century, the function of body cams. And on the one hand, we know Black activists and Black folks are using those images, those visuals, to mobilize, pushback against policing in the United States. But does it even serve the same kind of purpose that these lynching photos might have served, 75 years ago?
I think there's a real necessity there in thinking about the history, right? About how this current moment and the circulation of images of, I'll just call it Black destruction, or images of Black suffering and death, have been used. And what I'm still committed to, and kind of push back against in my book, is the idea of images either make us do something or don't make us do something. I want to return the responsibility to people, to us. So in this current moment, we can neither rest on our laurels and say that body cam footage is going to alleviate Black suffering because it's going to reveal some truth
Right.
about Black death. Nor can we, or nor should we, I should probably better say, think that those images are necessarily being circulated by those who want to ensure Black suffering. The image itself isn't doing the work so much as the context of exhibition
Right.
and the circumstances of circulation are.
The element of Black pain, and this is where our colleagues who do Afro-pessimism might weigh in certain kinds of ways, but there's a way in which Black pain has been mobilized, right? Generally speaking, whether we're talking visuals or sonic or so many other examples of it, that it almost becomes a defining piece of what we think of as Black identity in the United States. And I read you pushing back against that in certain kinds of ways. I think of it in line of the new work by Stephen Best, where he argues that somehow this original trauma is it's like a crime scene investigation that Black folks have to go back to over and over again. Given that kind of dynamic, when you think about contemporary film studies, which many folks have come to define as like the cinema of Black trauma, 12 Years a Slave being a great example of this. How do you imagine Black film studies going forward, divorced
Right, right.
from having to replay, again, to use Best's term, this crime scene of Black trauma?
Well, I think one of the ways that film studies crucially commits to this, getting beyond the kind of immiseration of the Black body in pain, is in differentiating between and thinking critically about the documentary image and moving away from indexicality in particular, or a purely realist assessment of what a representation of a Black body suffering, like in 12 Years a Slave, means on screen. And there's a lot to say about 12 Years a Slave, and the criticisms that, as you were saying, that folks really found that to be a kind of project of immiseration, very much akin to the kind of Afro-pessimist, this is what Black identity looks like. Right. And I think that critique is really over-determined by a kind of social science reading, or social scientific reading, the idea that the image is exclusively responsible to the past, to history, to experience, and not to giving us an opportunity to think about getting to a future, to think about, okay, so this has been our history, right? How do we think about it in new ways, to kind of even think about, like Audre Lorde, right? That poetry, and if we expand poetry to art, that art is the place where we get to think about what our futures can look like.
Right.
But we have to put them out there. We have to present those, right? We have to get them down on paper, we have to get them on film in order to imagine otherwise.
I'm struck by that, and this kind of move to the kind of moving image, if you will. Your next project really discusses this idea of an aesthetics of liberation. And so often, I think, in the mainstream, when we talk about Black film, right, or Black film studies, so much of the commentary and criticism pivots towards the sociological, right? Does this represent adequately this kind of experience, right? Do we overdetermine this kind of, are we contributing to certain kinds of pathologies within Black life that we actually have very little discussion about the aesthetics of Black filmmaking in that context?
Yeah, I have so much to say about this, and I'm glad books are a thing so that I can spend a lot of time exploring that. So there are a lot of ways of thinking, and in particular, a lot of kinds of work that I want to defend in my project, which looks at these representations in film not as these either failures or preoccupations, pornographic, right? Investments in the Black body in pain, and not just in pain, but just quote unquote inaccurate, right? So one is that there is a thing called Black film studies, and there are a lot of us,
Right.
right, who are really trained, and that's not meant to be an elitist assertion. That's to say that that's work, right, in thinking about how an image, how a cinematic image is put together,
Right.
how there's been a tradition of filmmaking, which also draws me to film work, the work of actors, the work of
Right.
set designers, the
Right.
work of directors, the work
Right.
of writers, that is work, and that there are those who are invested in the film industries, because there's not just one, to produce different representations, right? To what I'm saying is messing with the machinery,
Right.
right? Even though it's this industrial form, that there are ways in which it's possible within the cinematic medium to tell seemingly old stories. Maybe we could say that 12 Years a Slave is an old story, in a new register. And something that something that I think is really important specifically about 12 Years a Slave is that he didn't write a documentary,
Right.
That Solomon Northup wrote that book with a specific propagandist purpose,
Right.
which
Right.
was to defend himself in a courtroom when he wasn't able to testify against the Washington people who had
Right.
illegally enslaved him. And that book, the first edition, actually features a number of images. So it's not even accurate to say, well, that's a book adaptation to a visual medium, because that book is actually multimedia too.
Yeah. You do public writing about a range of things, and I want to think about particularly public film criticism at this point in time. There's a way in which we don't have a robust culture of think pieces on books because folks literally have to read the books.
Yeah.
I always got a kick out of when we talk about how successful Oprah's book club was. Oprah's book club was successful in getting people to buy. That's very
Your
different.
shelf looks nice.
Right. That's very different than actually reading them. And film functions the same kind of way in that it's accessible, right?
Right.
So everyone can weigh in, and it seems as though there's a space. Places like the New Yorker, as one example, where we get to see white critics do very serious film criticism. There's not that same kind of space for folks who are trained as film critics writing about blackness in that context.
That's true, and I would even say, even within film studies, there's a resistance to a kind of racial criticism that acknowledges formalism. So
Right.
one of the primary features of the specificity of being a film critic means to attend to the elements of the medium, that particular mode of telling a story. And I think it's really important, right, that we cultivate and continue to cultivate, because there's a long history of this, a Black film criticism, because, well, for a number of reasons. We need to talk about, well, for one thing, I want to lift up the labor that actual film practitioners
Right.
are endeavoring in. And these calls for developing a film criticism that can meet the responsibilities of a pro-Black filmmaking practice date back far, at
Right.
least to someone like Tony Cade Bambara,
Right.
or Juanima Lubiano.
Right.
Lubiano critiquing the fixation upon Spike Lee
Right.
as giving us an accurate, realistic
Right.
representation of Black life, as though he's the only spokesperson for that. And Bambara to look at a film, an avant-garde film, like Daughters of the Dust, and say, we really need to be smart enough to really address what's going on. So that kind of comes back around to the dominance of a certain kind of public criticism that is not as interested in the avant-garde, but I think even more detrimental to Black popular discourse, doesn't understand Blackness as being negotiable, as being anything beyond being realistic. which is something that my colleagues Raquel Gates and also Michael Gillespie really talk beautifully about. And they're not the only ones.
Yes. You've been joined today, this afternoon, by Professor Courtney Baker, Associate Professor of English at the University of California in Riverside. She's the author of the book, Humane Insight, Looking at the Images of African American Suffering and Death, published by the University of Illinois Press. She is an alumni of Duke University, PhD in the Literature Department. Thank you for joining us today, Courtney.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure.
At the top is Barack and a stack of all black jeans, cause I'm never gonna slack. Black boy shorts on my ass, like teachers stay on short. Black boys in class, so they grow to lead the masses. Black sunglasses, cause my future bright. Molasses, Blackberry, write my rhymes in them every night, they scary. Black scarves, represent scars.